everyone, and welcome to today's live PETAA webinar. I'm Megan Edwards, the General Manager of PETAA, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host today for what promises to be a really fascinating hour ahead. As I'm sure you're all aware, as you've signed up, we are delighted to be joined today by Professor Peter O'Connor, and Peter is going to be talking to us about the incredible Rito Toi, which is a resource that has been created for teachers working with children when they first return to school following major traumatic or life-changing events. So clearly with the current situation around COVID-19 and schools around Australia and the world starting to return to not quite normal service, then there has never been a more relevant and critical time for resources such as those that Peter has been working hard to create. And Peter's going to be talking to us today about the how, the why of Rito Toi, and fantastically actually giving us a live demo as well and walking us through the site, which is going to be wonderful. Now, you will have noticed when you came into the room, you are all on mute today. We're recording the webinar, and of course we do have quite a number of you joining us live. And so we've decided to keep everyone on mute just to protect the sound quality. And make sure that we can have the optimal experience and hear from Peter. But we do want to encourage you to send through your questions, your comments, and so on. So please do use the chat box. If you haven't already opened it up, you'll find the option to open your chat box in the bottom middle of your screen. Click on that, and you can send your questions through. We're going to have a Q&A between Peter and myself using your questions at the end of the session today. So shoot them through and we'll talk through as many as we can at that point. Now, I'm going to do an introduction to Peter in just a moment, but first up, Peter's actually very kindly shared a short video with us that I'm going to pop up on the screen now, as I suspect this will be a much better introduction to Peter than I will be able to do, but we will start with this.
I'm Peter O'Connor, and I'm a specialist in making and researching applied theatre. I've been using theatre in all sorts of dark places for a very long time, so I've developed a lot of skills and ways of working which are second hand to me. I've done work in disaster zones, post-earthquake work, since 2008, so for 10 years. I was initially invited up to work in China following the earthquakes in Sichuan. And that work was to help communities to rebuild. Post-disaster, there's a focus on the physical world when people go into repair and rebuild. But a disaster is largely a disaster because of the way in which it impacts on human beings. So how do we begin to understand how you can repair and rebuild communities? The arts have always been a tool that we've used to understand the world. So when the world tips upside down, how do you get it back up again? And the role for the arts to do that, and that's hugely important.
My latest piece of work is making a show with members of the Auckland homeless community as part of the Fringe Festival.
The research is leading because it's asking a really difficult question that we don't know the answer to. How do the arts rebuild communities? The invitations that I get to do the work, or the teams that I've set up internationally continuing the work. Those two indicators, I think, let us know that the work's cutting edge.
Fantastic. What a beautiful video, Peter, and really showcasing there some of the amazing work that you've been doing. And yes, as I said, apologies, that was still playing in the background for me there, so sorry. I think that video will probably give a far better introduction to Peter than I can, but if you'll bear with me, as there were a couple of things I did want to mention in my introduction to Peter. As I've said, Peter is a professor at the University of Auckland, and he's an internationally recognised expert in making and researching applied theatre and drama education. He's passionate about investigating the nature and application of creativity in everyday life, and his work in schools after the Christchurch earthquakes led to UNESCO-funded research and programme development. And Rito Toi is Peter's latest brainchild, as it was explained to me by someone who sent me Peter's way. And Peter, thank you so much firstly for creating Rito Toi. It is beautiful, and I'm really excited and privileged to see you walk us through it today. But also for taking this time out of your, I know, incredibly packed schedule at the moment to meet with PETAA's members and introduce us today to Rito Toi. Thank you so much.
Ngā mihi nui a koutou nā rangatira. Kia ora, everybody. You'll see that one of the things which has happened when you're locked down in a house for a while without a razor blade is that I look a little different to how I looked last year when I was doing that work with the Homeless Theatre Company. You know, Neil Gaiman, some of you might know him as a wonderful writer, talked about this period in our life by saying that there's no word in the English language for the space between, that moment between the drawing in of breath and the breathing out. And we are in that moment between the liminal space, a limbo world, for those of us who are Catholics, might recognise that reference. I think many of us in education have thought that in that moment between, that moment before we fully go back, we can either, we can take one of two choices. We can bounce back to what we were, or we can leap, skip and dance and hope into something different. And I'm for not bouncing back, I'm for leaping forward with COVID. And so if any good might come from this, we might shift what we do in classrooms, we might kind of reimagine how we work. And Rito Toi is all about that, really. It's about reimagining that rather than going back to school and catching up with literacy and numeracy and all those kinds of things, preparing kids for NAPLAN tests, doing all that work, we might go back and focus in on something else instead, and that would be well-being, catching up with relationships rather than catching up with lost time, and thinking that perhaps if we do that, that might also meet some of the other kinds of things that we have to do as teachers. I've worked in multiple disaster zones in schools with kids and teachers, and I know how bloody hard it is to do that work, and I have nothing but respect for teachers who do that, usually unacknowledged. There'll be all sorts of medals given out to all sorts of people who are doing all sorts of things, but you very rarely see teachers get any of those. I know that often after disasters, it's teachers and principals and schools who do all the work and pulling together children's lives. You are a vital part of the rebuild. Now, your government is focusing on the economic rebuild post-COVID, but there's another rebuild, and that's the rebuild of spirit, the rebuild of our mental health, the rebuild of our sense of community. And teachers will be left with that job. I also know, because I work in an initial teacher education faculty in a university, that very few teachers have been trained how to do that work. You'll just be left to make it up on your own. And there'll be lots of teachers who will be worried and nervous about getting it wrong. What if I get kids to talk about this stuff and it all just falls out all over the place and I don't know how to pick it back up? What do I do when kids come in and they say to me, Miss, Dad says we're going to lose everything. What do you say? You know, there will be children who will have seen on the news, heard on the radio, all about people dying all over the place by something that's invisible that they can't control. So one of the things that I know is that kids will come back to school with lots and lots and lots of questions. Schools internationally have been set up to prepare kids for the future. We call it futures focused curriculum. It's really hard to sustain an idea that that's what school should be about when no one's sure what the future will be. We kind of hope it will be one thing, especially here in Australia and New Zealand when our COVID numbers are so comparatively low. But there's another purpose, which has always sat somehow in tension with that idea about preparing for the future. And that is that schools are also about helping kids make sense of the world in which they live. And maybe you need to focus more and more on that than anything else when kids come back. You know, your job will be to help make sense of something which is pretty senseless, hard. So part of the reason for building Te Rito Toi is that, having worked in lots of disaster zones, most recently coming and helping teachers in Sydney, my God, you've had a hard year in Australia, haven't you? Who can believe it was only a couple of months ago that you were dealing with blackened skies and earth? You know, people hanging off the edge of beaches to be rescued as their houses and homes burnt to the ground. So you know what it's like to bring kids back into school after disaster. And you'll know that focusing in on those questions and helping them answer them are really important. You'll also know that your ministries of education probably left you pretty much on your own with that, trying to make it up as you go along. So Te Rito Toi was about, you know, was motivated by that. How do you help teachers at this really, really difficult time? You know, I worked in Christchurch 10 days after the earthquake that killed 185 people. I worked in Mexico City within weeks of an earthquake that killed nearly 400 and injured nearly 6,000 people, and worked in the most quake-affected parts of the city during earthquakes. And what I learned, and what the research tells me, is that one of the best ways back is to focus on well-being and to do that through the arts. So you can go to the arts curriculum. And the reason for that is really simple. At one level, as human beings, we create fictional worlds to better understand our real world. That's the purpose of fiction. We go into fictional worlds to try new things, to understand new ways, to think of new parts of who we might be, so we can understand ourselves better. And so when you go back to school, it will be fiction and fictional processes which provide safe, distanced structures for you to talk about the huge questions that children have because of COVID-19. Te Rito Toi, what does it mean? There's a plant here in New Zealand, very like the flax plant. We call it harakeke in Māori. And harakeke has these great, you'll see it when you see the site, has these great, wonderful leaves, which were used for just about everything pre-contact, before white people stumbled upon New Zealand. And at the heart of it is this tiny seedling called Te Rito, the tiny little piece of it, which sits at the heart, and the leaves surround it to keep it safe. Schools are like that with little ones, aren't they? You know, schools and teachers provide that wraparound to keep the seedlings safe. And that's the job that you'll be doing when schools go back. You'll be like that covering for the seedling. You damage the seedling, the plant dies. And we know that too, that we can't afford to damage our seedlings, that caring for the seedling is caring for the plant. Te Rito, the seedling. Te Rito Toi. Toi is the arts. So Te Rito Toi means that it will be the arts which surround the child, will keep them safe, will look after them, and that we need to look after the arts and the seedling if the plant will grow. We were gifted the name Te Rito Toi by our kaumātua, our elderly chief here at the University of Auckland. And what a beautiful gift we were given to understand that a way to think about learning, a way to think about how we go back to school comes from Māori cosmology, comes from Māori understandings of the way the world is. Since we launched the site, we've had over 80,000 views of the work and interest from all over the world, including here across the Tasman in our soon-to-be added bubble. We can't wait. We can't wait for you, all the Australians, to come here and spend your money and help build our economy again. And we'll come and do the same with you. Megan, would it make sense to have a look at the site?
Yes, I think that would be brilliant. Thanks, Peter. If you're happy to bring it up and screen share from your side.
Now, can everyone see it?
Perfect. Yeah, wonderful. That's coming up.
So here's the opening page. We built this in 2 weeks. We worked pretty hard, and I need to acknowledge my colleague and friend, Alex Harvey, who did all the work. You know, the professor gets all the credit for it, but Alex did an extraordinary amount of work to make this happen. And what we've done is load it with lots of lovely artwork. There you are. You can see the harakeke plant, and the te reto, and over there in the graphic. Also designed for us by a wonderful Māori artist. You know, the stories, concerns and questions have to be addressed in classrooms. The worst advice you could give somebody is to go back to school and pretend the last 8 weeks hasn't happened. Just go back and open it up as if kind of somehow COVID-19 isn't a thing. You might laugh, you might kind of think, surely no one would do that. But I know that's what happens sometimes. The most human, the most powerful response you can have as a teacher is human, is to be human. And to do that is to say, not to dwell on what's happened, but to find ways to think and talk about with your children the kinds of things that they need answers to, and recognizing sometimes for little ones, as it is for older ones, it's impossible to get to the questions through words. And that's where the arts are so powerful. The site has all sorts of different bits to it. And you can go through it in all sorts of different ways. So just as an overview, there's a whole section there on advice for principals and teachers. And that section was written by Professor Carol Much, who is the UNESCO Commissioner for Education. And it's practical advice and support to guide teachers and principals in the return to school. And we'll have a little look in there in a moment. The classroom support section there, there's about 40 different lessons that you could use using the arts in the first days and weeks that you go back with your school. And we'll talk about what they look like in a moment. The bigger context, I'm just going to move that away from me so I can see. The bigger context looks at the research behind this and links you into some wonderful resources developed by Professor Helen Cahill at the University of Melbourne around social and emotional well-being. Gorgeous, gorgeous material. And for those of you who are sort of thinking, I need some more of this. That's a wonderful place to go. Whoops. Sorry. I'm going to flick back. I don't know if you play rugby in Australia. That was a bit mean. This next piece of work was developed with Sir John Kirwan Foundation, who some of you might know has played a game called rugby here in a team called the All Blacks. And Sir John set up a foundation around dealing with mental health and depression. He talks about the time he was playing in a test match against Australia and had a panic attack. And so we've been working with the Kirwan Foundation, and we've produced a resource around anxious classrooms, anxious students. And that might be where we go to. So if you click on that, it takes you through to a whole series of lesson plans. There we go. We can click on the lesson plans. When you go in there, you'll see that it's been written for New Zealand teachers. But here are some of the questions: what different queer feelings do we have, and how do we express them at different times? Who or what helps us deal with our feelings? What can we do to help others and others understand change and loss? One of the things that we know is that part of what's happened is that kids have lost things. We've all lost stuff, and some more than others with COVID-19. So you'll see there's the learning outcomes are all there for you, links for us to our curriculum. And one of the things that we do is that we don't ask kids to talk about their emotions or feelings when they come back to school, but we use fiction to help kids talk about that. And so we introduce them to a teddy bear. And if I can find the teddy bear book that we're using. This is great for 5-year-olds. Bear goes into lockdown. The Diary of Bear, book 1. Hello, my name is Bear. I live in a house in the country with 2 humans. I share a toy box. One day my humans took me out of the toy box to tell me they had a very important job for me to do. I had to stay inside and home from school. He had to say goodbye to the toys. So what you can do, you can talk about that with 5- and 6-year-olds. How does Bear feel when he has to say goodbye to the toys? And I started my new life. What does it feel like to try new things? And what's it like for Bear to feel like? And that's the safety and the distancing of the fiction. One of the things which happens in Bear's life, it's a lovely book. You can see Bear having, felt sad at the children's playground. I don't know about in Australia, but our playgrounds have all been shut. Kids haven't been allowed to play on the playgrounds. So what you can do, of course, is you can talk about how Bear feels about that. And why did Bear feel that way? And how does Bear feel now that he can use that? If I just flick through, one of the things that happens for Bear is that an auntie dies and he's not allowed to go to the funeral. And that's certainly been a case for lots of children here in New Zealand. And you don't have to talk about that from your personal experience, but you can talk about it from Bear's experience. And what we've done is to provide in the lesson plan all sorts of ways in which you can do that. What was one feeling that Bear had during the lockdown? Why did Bear have this feeling and not another feeling? And lots and lots of very, very practical advice and support on how to use that. There's a gorgeous book, a children's book that we're using, and I think this is why, for me, Primary English Teachers Association will love Rito Toi. It's full of picture books. Picture books are the best single way that you can go back to school. Aroha way, aroha is the Māori word for love, is a story of a little girl who gets butterflies in her tummy all the time because she's just nervous of the world. And then, and there's going to be lots of kids coming back to school like that, and there were anyway, weren't there? And they still were because of the bushfires. My God. So, you know, this is a way of looking at it. How does Aroha's face and body change in the pictures? Why did she feel small and meek? When have you felt belly tumble with butterfly wings? Why did your puku, that's Māori for tummy, feel like that? Why did the author write where she, you know, so lots of really good questioning of the story, but they're actually questions about feeling anxious and what you might be able to do when you're feeling anxious. So again, it's that whole idea of using fiction as ways of thinking about and understanding stuff. Hopefully that makes some sense. I just want to get back. Oh, here we go. So there's weeks of work in there. And I know what teachers do because I've been a teacher myself for a very long time, is you'll go and I'll use that bit and I'll use that bit, but I won't use that. I'll grab that idea and I'll sort that. You don't have to do that. It's all there and you can just follow along as well. Because I know at the moment, you're planning online, you're planning for classroom teaching. Well, that's what they're doing in New Zealand, doing all those things all at the same time. So going into anxious classrooms, anxious students does that. But look at this. Here's a gorgeous one for you, primary English teachers. It's Superpower Poetry Fun. And this was written especially for us by Selina Tusitala Marsh, who is our New Zealand's Poet Laureate. And she's written a beautiful lesson plan on how you can get kids to talk about the superpowers that they have inside themselves to sustain themselves when the world goes wrong. And it's a gorgeous lesson. We've been encouraging here in New Zealand teachers to do it online. And when they do it online with their classes, they get whole families to write superpower poems. And I'm hoping in a week or two, we're going to load some of those onto the site as well. So you certainly can see that. Back to classroom support, you'll see that we've got some lovely dramas. The Giant Who Threw Tantrums, The Giant Who Threw Tantrums was developed by Professor John O'Toole and Professor Julie Dunn at Griffith University. They're beautiful. The Giant Who Threw Tantrums is all about how come people, when they're really nervous and worried about the world, get angry. Now, there's lots of kids who will be experiencing that at home, and you don't necessarily want to unpack those stories about their real lives, but you can unpack it through The Giant Who Threw Tantrums. My Many Coloured Days. Hello again is lovely. In New Zealand, we're going to have to relearn how we greet each other. And hello again, because you can't, you know, pressing the noses, hongi, hugs and kisses, which is how we usually do stuff, but we're not allowed to do that anymore. So hello again is a lovely dance unit, and how you can rethink how we say hello and do that in a really fun way. Ha'ora is a set of Māori resources which are gorgeous. There's waiata, which is Māori song, there's kani kani, which is dance, and haka, and all sorts in there. It's gorgeous. 2 Stars and a Wish is a beautiful drama about how you can, and dance piece, about how you might imagine the world better and all the kinds of things that you will need to do to get, not back to normal, but to get on a track where things are going really well. Regulating Robot is a really good resource with older kids. Now, this is level 3, so for us in New Zealand, that's around 8 and 9 years old. And that's a drama about why do you have to follow rules all the time? I mean, one of the things about COVID-19 is there's all these rules that adults have about how you have to do things. And this is a drama which helps kids think about why you have rules. So there's all those, and I have to, because it's my one, show off Teaspoon of Light. Teaspoon of Light is a drama work that I think you could do in the first days back. I did this originally in 2011 with kids on the first day they came back after the earthquake disasters. I used it in Mexico, and when I ran workshops for teachers in Sydney at the beginning of this year, I did this Teaspoon of Light. It's a really simple drama. A little girl wakes up in the morning and she sees her cloth of dreams is torn. And you ask the kids if they'll help the little girl in the story. Little kids will always help someone in trouble in a story. And what you can do is make cloths of dreams with all the hopes of the future on them to help the little girl in the story. And if you're really lucky, you can use a teaspoon of light, sprinkle it through everything, and fix your torn cloth. There's a video that you can see in there of the work that I did in Christchurch. That turned into a UNESCO-funded project and has worked in schools for 10 years. One of the things which that brings me to is that it's really important what you do in the first couple of weeks, but you know what? I hate to tell you this, but you're going to be picking up the pieces of COVID-19 for years. You know, you're going to be picking up the mess for a very long time. And these resources you can go to not just in the first couple of weeks, but you can keep going back to them because you're going to need to. That's the truth, I'm sorry. And you know it anyway. You know it from the bushfires. You've only just some of you just climbing out of that and some of the communities in which you're in. Let's have a quick look, because I think you guys would really like it. Whoops, I'll just move that down. Picture books. We've curated some picture books that we think are really, really good. Invisible String is a lovely book for coping with all kinds of separation, anxiety, loss and grief. So what we're saying is, yeah, it's really important when you go back to school, go back to routines, use your big books, but think about the kinds of books that you might use. Invisible String's great. The Fox and the Stars are a beautiful book. I love it. It's about needing things and losing things. And then this lovely book, A Terrible Thing Happened, which is, you know, at first he tried to forget it, but soon something inside him started to bother him. Now that's many, many kids, isn't it? Dad's lost his job. You know, we don't know if we'll be able to still stay in our house, all those kinds of things. This one here is one of my favourite. Laszlo was afraid of the dark. The dark lives in the same house as Laszlo. Mostly, though, the dark stays in the basement and doesn't come into Laszlo's room, but one night it does. It's a great book to kind of look at the ideas of why and how you might be frightened of things you can't see. Sometimes it's hard to be brave. We've asked kids to be really brave, haven't we? Sometimes you're just not ready until one day you are. So we've curated those picture books for you to think about using. Advice for teachers and principals. And then I'm going to stop and maybe we'll see if we've got some questions. We've got this, so these are the kinds of things that we're saying. Look after yourself and each other, and there's lots of advice there from Carol about how you do that. Getting ready for the return of some students. In New Zealand, it's been far more stepped, I think, than it is going to be in Australia. We've just got different kinds of things. But one piece of advice that I would suggest to any principals is that the first thing you need to do when you go back to school is not just to go leaping back into classrooms and think only of the kids. There's a wonderful New Zealand singer here called Greg Johnson, who wrote a song with a lyric, first you save yourself, then you save the world. And teachers must care for themselves first. Otherwise, they're no use to anybody. And how you do that as a community in your school, and how you support each other. You know, I saw it in Christchurch for years. Teachers whose own houses were destroyed, who had huge issues with their own children and their own marital relationships or partner relationships, getting up day after day after day and caring for other people's children. It's what teachers do. It's why teachers are extraordinary people with superpowers all of their own. Care for yourself, and there's some really good advice around that. I met with lots of teachers in Sydney at the beginning of the year, and we spoke for just an hour about how we felt about the bushfires. As a staff, when you go back, you all need to have that same conversation. You all need to sit and talk about the world. When you get out of what we call bubbles here in New Zealand, your small little groups of people who are together, and you're finally together in one staff room, don't just talk about the kids. Don't just talk about the learning. Talk about yourselves. Talk about your needs. Talk about what you want. Talk about how you're going to all survive this together. And then the final bit, and this piece was written by my wife, who is doing her PhD around family violence and child abuse. Everyone has experienced social isolation differently. For some children, getting back to school will be a blessed relief from what's been going on at home. And you need to be really aware that child abuse, family violence, will not have decreased in the months that kids have been at home with parents. Some of our kids in Auckland are sharing garages with 9 or 10 others. Dad's off or mum's off, alcohol, all the kinds of things. Doubled up now, of course, by loss of income. And the victims often of that are children. The biggest group of people who report child abuse in New Zealand, and I know it's the same in Australia, are teachers. So you need to look really closely, really carefully when kids come back to see what damage has happened, because you're their defenders. Amongst all the other stuff you've got to do, you've got to do that as well. We built Te Rito Toi because we know how hard the job is, how much is expected and required of you normally. My God, it's even bigger now. And so we hope and pray, literally, that Te Rito Toi is of benefit to you, that you'll use it well, that you'll share it with others, you'll take the bits that are good for you. That took longer than I thought, sorry, Megan, but I'm going to stop and pass it back to you.
No, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Peter. I mean, there is a lot to unpack on the site. There is a lot that is really practical advice and toolkits for teachers out there, which is one of the numerous reasons I love it. And that was brilliant, seeing the different lesson plans and units that are in there, and the fact that you've got so many options. You've used poetry, you've used literature, you've used drama, you've used dance. So depending on sort of what teachers may feel most comfortable with, or the students might feel most comfortable with, there's an option for everyone in there. And preferably, of course, you use the whole suite, because there were so many beautiful resources there for people to use. I was writing down notes frantically as you were going through as well, for sort of ideas for myself, and the books that you've recommended there, which I think are really important, as there aren't any ready curated pools of or libraries, I suppose I should say, of books out there to look to for situations like this. And I mentioned to you when we spoke last week on the phone, Peter, and said, you know, I was so impressed at how beautiful the website was. And we might just quickly stop that there. There we go. And you know how absolutely stunning it was. And you told me, what was it, a whopping, I think 14 days that you pulled together that site, which is just phenomenal. So yes, a huge thank you for bringing that together.
Well, you know, it's really interesting because this week's been full of media stuff around it here in New Zealand, but it was a great kind of recognising that maybe having spent the last 10 years working in disaster zones, the biggest disaster the world's ever known, or certainly known in generations, that I could use some of the kinds of things I've learned to help and support teachers was a great gift. Kept my mental health as I was doing whatever it was, 15, 16-hour days, really well. But one of the things that I realised is that I've now come out the other side. I now need to look after myself a little bit too, and that's the important thing, isn't it? You know, we've been in lockdown now for nearly 6 weeks, and it's starting to wear thin.
Yes,
it really is starting to wear thin.
I feel with you on that one. And we've got a few questions coming through actually, Peter. So we might jump over into the question box. And we've got one come through from Robin Cox. So I'm going to come to Robin first. She is on our board of directors here at PETAA. She was our president for 9 years. She stepped down in February, and Robin is actually the one who originally brought Rito Toi to our attention at PETAA. So we owe Robin a debt of gratitude for that. And Robin's asked you, Peter, often in the preparation of teachers, it is good to run one of these lessons as a model lesson plan in teacher education tutorials. As a teacher educator yourself, is there one lesson plan you can recommend for this purpose?
Yeah, I mean, well, without pushing my own barrow, but, the Teaspoon of Light was built. I went down to Christchurch 10 days after the earthquake and set it up so that I had teachers watching me teach with children literally on the first day they came back. And so I modelled what I thought teachers could do. And so I built a unit of work that's really, really simple, doesn't take much to do. And yet it really flicks kids into and back into learning. So I think in initial teacher, and what's been really, it's been picked up all over the world and used to train teachers to do. The YouTube clips had something like 20,000 views since it went up, and that's because it's used a lot around the world in initial teacher education. So I would recommend Teaspoon of Light. It's a 1 or 2 hour lesson. It's a 1 hour lesson. You can unpack a lot. The other thing for initial teacher education is that there's been an enormous amount written about it in academic journals and books. There's videos of me doing the work. There's all sorts of those kinds of things. So certainly for initial teacher education, that I think is a really useful resource. And it's kind of like, I'll put it back in because of that, I think. Pretty much, and one of the things for me was that I did that work in Christchurch when it reopened 10 days after the quake. I went back 2 weeks later and I went round schools in Christchurch, and there were repaired dream cloths and classroom windows all over Christchurch, which suggested to me that it was a resource that could be very quickly and easily picked up by teachers.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. Excellent. So you all know where to head to first when you jump onto Rito Toi straight after this webinar.